There was a time when car designers weren't afraid to experiment. Buttons were everywhere, dashboards looked like aircraft cockpits, and features appeared that seemed futuristic, clever, or just plain strange. Some were loved, some were confusing, and some were simply too weird to survive. Over time, regulations, costs, and changing tastes erased them completely. These are 15 unusual car features that once existed and then completely disappeared, almost forgotten by history. Swivel front seats were one of those wonderfully mid-century ideas that perfectly captured how American car makers thought about comfort, dignity, and convenience in the post-war era. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the automobile was not just transportation, it was an extension of the living room, and manufacturers obsessed over making the experience feel effortless and civilized. Engineers and designers genuinely believed that one of the great daily annoyances of driving was the awkward act of climbing in and out of a low, wide car while wearing a suit, a dress, or a hat. The swivel seat was their elegant solution, a mechanical courtesy designed to make entering a car feel like sitting down at a restaurant table rather than folding yourself into a machine. When you opened the door, the seat would rotate outward, sometimes as much as 90 degrees, presenting itself to the driver like a welcoming chair. You would sit down naturally, close the door, and then swing your legs inside as the seat rotated back into driving position. For older drivers, people with limited mobility, or anyone who simply valued comfort, it felt luxurious and thoughtful. Oldsmobile marketed it heavily in the late 1950s, especially on higher-end models, while Ford and Chrysler offered their own versions either as options or experimental features. At the time, it genuinely felt like the future of ergonomic design. The problem was that swivel seats were mechanically complicated in an era when simplicity still mattered. The rotating mechanisms had to lock firmly in place while driving, remain smooth enough to operate easily, and still withstand years of wear. Over time, many developed squeaks, looseness, or alignment issues. Some owners complained that the seat no longer felt solid once it was locked forward, giving an unsettling sense of movement while driving. Repairs were expensive, parts were unique, and not every dealer technician understood how to service them properly. What began as a luxury feature could quickly become a nuisance. The real death blow, however, came from safety regulations. As seatbelts became mandatory and crash standards tightened in the 1960s, swivel seats turned from a clever idea into a regulatory nightmare. Anchoring seatbelts to a moving, rotating seat created engineering challenges that were difficult and costly to solve. In a collision, the seat had to remain perfectly aligned and locked, and regulators were not comfortable with mechanisms that introduced any uncertainty. From a legal and liability standpoint, swivel seats were suddenly risky. Car makers, already under pressure to redesign interiors for safety compliance, quietly dropped them rather than invest heavily in making them regulation-proof. What's fascinating is that many people who experienced swivel seats absolutely loved them. Older owners, in particular, remembered them fondly, often describing them as one of the most considerate features ever put into a car. They were practical in a way modern cars rarely attempt, prioritizing ease of use over performance or styling. Yet because they disappeared so quietly, they became almost forgotten, rarely mentioned in automotive histories, except as a quirky footnote. Today, swivel seats feel like a relic of a different mindset, a time when comfort features could be whimsical, mechanical, and unapologetically indulgent. They represent an era when manufacturers believed luxury meant making life easier in small human ways, not just adding power or technology. Remembered now mostly by those who once owned them or experienced them firsthand, swivel front seats remain a symbol of a brief moment when getting in and out of a car gracefully was considered an engineering problem worth solving. Push-button automatic transmissions were one of those ideas that made perfect sense inside a late 1950s design studio and far less sense in the real world of distracted, imperfect human drivers. This was the height of the space-age mindset, when America was obsessed with jets, rackets, and control panels full of switches. Traditional column-mounted gear levers suddenly felt old-fashioned, even agricultural. Chrysler, always eager to look technologically bold, leaned hard into the concept and became the brand most closely associated with push-button automatics, especially from 1956 through the mid-1960s. From a design perspective, the idea was genuinely elegant. Instead of a long chrome lever cluttering the steering column, you got a neat row of buttons integrated into the dashboard. Each gear had its own clearly labeled button: drive, reverse, neutral, sometimes low, or park, depending on the year. It cleaned up the interior visually and reinforced the feeling that you were operating a machine of the future. Chrysler advertising loved to show well-dressed drivers calmly selecting gears with a fingertip, as if they were commanding a jetliner rather than a family sedan. Mechanically, these systems were not electronic fantasies, they were entirely mechanical. Pressing a button pulled a cable that physically shifted the transmission. This meant they were actually quite robust when properly adjusted, and many owners reported that the systems themselves were not especially failure-prone. The real problem was not reliability, but human behavior. Drivers had spent decades developing muscle memory around levers. In stressful situations, that muscle memory mattered. When something unexpected happened, drivers instinctively reached for a shifter that wasn't there. Panic situations exposed the flaw brutally. Instead of a single lever with a clear physical path, push-button systems offered multiple equally sized buttons in close proximity. Pressing the wrong one was easy, especially under stress. There were documented cases of drivers accidentally selecting reverse instead of drive or neutral instead of low, simply because their hand moved faster than their brain. Unlike a lever, which provides tactile feedback as it moves through positions, buttons were binary. You pressed them and the car responded instantly, for better or worse. Another issue was inconsistency across manufacturers. Chrysler's layout differed from Mercury's brief experiments, which differed again from Edsall's button-based controls. There was no standard placement, no universal logic. As safety regulators and driving instructors began emphasizing standardization for training and accident prevention, push-button transmissions became an obvious problem. A rental car or borrowed vehicle could suddenly feel unfamiliar in a dangerous way, and regulators did not like that at all. Hidden headlight doors powered by engine vacuum were one of those beautifully flawed solutions that perfectly capture how car engineering used to work: clever, elegant on paper, and deeply annoying in real life. In the 1960s and 1970s, designers desperately wanted clean, uninterrupted body lines. Fixed headlights ruined aerodynamics and aesthetics, especially as cars grew lower and wider. Electric motors existed, but they were expensive, bulky, unreliable, and not yet trusted to survive years of heat, moisture, and vibration. Vacuum, on the other hand, was already there. Every internal combustion engine produced it for free, so engineers used what they had. The system itself was deceptively simple. Engine vacuum was routed through a maze of rubber hoses, check valves, reservoirs, and diaphragms. When the driver turned on the headlights, vacuum actuators pulled the doors open. Turn the lights off, vacuum was redirected, and springs, or reverse pressure, closed them again. When everything was new and working perfectly, it felt magical. The headlights rose silently, smoothly, and with a certain theatrical grace that electric motors rarely matched. On a brand new Corvette, Camaro, Firebird, or Lincoln Continental, it felt like luxury technology. Then, reality set in. Vacuum systems are only as good as their weakest hose, and those hoses lived in hot engine bays for years. Rubber dried out, cracked, and leaked. Tiny leaks caused big problems. A door that once snapped open confidently would begin to hesitate, creeping upward like it had lost motivation. In cold weather, the rubber stiffened, diaphragms shrank, and suddenly one headlight would open while the other stayed half closed, giving the car a lopsided, embarrassed expression. Owners joked that their cars looked sleepy, drunk, or emotionally exhausted. The most infamous flaw appeared when the engine stalled or was shut off at the wrong moment. Because the system relied on engine vacuum, no engine meant no pressure. Some cars used vacuum reservoirs to store a small amount, but once that was depleted, the headlights simply refused to move. This led to the deeply ironic situation where a car could lose power at night and instantly lose its headlights as well. In some designs, the doors defaulted closed. In others, they stayed wherever they happened to be when the engine died. Neither outcome inspired confidence. Maintenance was constant and infuriating. Diagnosing vacuum leaks was more art than science. A single cracked hose buried deep under the dashboard or fender could disable the entire system. Owners and mechanics chased problems endlessly, replacing hoses one by one, checking valves, and hoping they'd guessed correctly. Many eventually gave up and either wired the doors permanently open or converted them to crude manual setups. The sleek look that sold the car new slowly turned into a source of resentment. Record players built into dashboards were one of the most optimistic and least realistic ideas Detroit ever tried to sell as luxury technology. In the mid to late 1950s, before cassette tapes and long before digital audio, engineers genuinely believed that the problem with in-car entertainment wasn't durability or convenience, but sound quality. If living rooms had high-fidelity record players, then a truly upscale automobile, especially one built for endless American highways, should have the same experience. That logic led Chrysler to introduce the Highway Hi-Fi, the most famous and ambitious attempt to put a turntable inside a moving car. On paper, it sounded brilliant. The system was mounted under the dashboard and used a specially designed turntable with a heavy tone arm and extra tracking force to keep the needle in the groove. The records themselves were proprietary, thicker than normal vinyl, and designed to spin at 16 2/3 RPM instead of the usual 33 1/3. This slower speed allowed longer playtime per side, up to nearly an hour, which meant fewer interruptions on long drives. Chrysler partnered with major record labels to offer classical music, Broadway shows, easy listening, and spoken word content. It was marketed not as a novelty, but as a serious, cultured alternative to crackly AM radio. Reality was far less elegant. Even with all the engineering tricks, a car is still a car. Roads aren't smooth, suspensions aren't perfect, and vibrations come from everywhere. Expansion joints, potholes, rough pavement, even hard braking could send the needle skating across the record. While the system worked reasonably well on freshly paved highways, it became nearly unusable on city streets or rural roads. Owners quickly learned that highway in Highway Hi-Fi was not marketing poetry, but a strict operating condition. Heat was another killer. Car interiors in the 1950s had limited ventilation and weak air conditioning, if any at all. Vinyl records do not like heat. They warped, softened, and degraded quickly when left in a parked car under the sun. Many owners discovered that their expensive proprietary records had turned into wavy, unplayable plastic within a single summer. Replacements were costly and increasingly hard to find, since these records could not be played on home turntables.
3-on-the-tree manual shifters were once so normal that nobody questioned them, which is what makes them feel so strange today. For decades, especially from the late 1940s through the mid-1960s, a column-mounted manual transmission was the default layout for American cars. It wasn't a sporty choice or a cost-cutting trick. It was simply how cars were built when maximizing interior space mattered more than driving involvement. By moving the shifter off the floor and onto the steering column, manufacturers could install a full-width front bench seat and advertise room for 6 adults, a major selling point in an era when families, neighbors, and even coworkers often rode together. Mechanically, the system was a compromise from the very beginning. Instead of a short, direct lever going straight into the transmission, 3-on-the-tree setups relied on long rods, levers, bushings, and pivots that ran from the steering column down through the firewall and along the frame. Every joint introduced play. Every bushing wore over time. By the time the motion reached the transmission, what started as a clean hand movement had turned into something vague and approximate. New cars could feel acceptable, even pleasant, but age was merciless. A few years of wear and suddenly first gear was somewhere between 2 positions, second required a deliberate pause, and third sometimes refused to engage at all. The shift pattern itself was unintuitive by modern standards. First gear was typically up and toward the driver, second straight down, and third up and away. Reverse often required pushing the lever inward or lifting it before moving, which added another layer of confusion. Drivers learned the pattern through habit rather than logic. Muscle memory mattered more than precision, and panic situations exposed the weaknesses immediately. Miss a 1-2 shift, and you could lock the linkage between gears, leaving the car stuck in neutral until someone crawled under the hood to manually realign the rods. Performance jogging was effectively out of the question. Fast shifts were difficult, slow shifts were common, and aggressive driving often resulted in gear clash or missed engagement. Enthusiasts hated them. Even when powerful engines were paired with 3-on-the-tree gearboxes, the transmission became the limiting factor. The car might have had plenty of torque, but the shifter demanded patience and restraint. This is one reason why early American performance cars still felt lazy compared to their European counterparts. The drivetrain layout simply didn't encourage driver involvement. Yet for everyday driving, especially in traffic-heavy cities or on relaxed highways, 3-on-the-tree had a certain charm. The long lever moved slowly and deliberately. Shifts felt ceremonial rather than urgent. There was a rhythm to it that matched the character of the cars themselves, big, soft, and unhurried. For many drivers, especially older ones, it felt more dignified than a floor shifter, which was sometimes associated with sports cars, imports, or youth culture. Headlight dimmer switches on the floor were once such a deeply ingrained part of driving that nobody thought to question them. From the 1930s through the late 1960s, if you got into an American car at night, your left foot knew exactly what to do. Somewhere to the left of the clutch or brake pedal, usually a small round rubber button sat quietly, waiting to be tapped. One press for high beams, another for low. It was simple, mechanical, and completely invisible until you needed it. The logic behind the floor-mounted dimmer actually made sense in its time. Early dashboards were already crowded with knobs, levers, radios, heaters, ashtrays, and ignition switches. Steering columns were thin and uncluttered, often carrying little more than the wheel itself. Putting the dimmer on the floor freed up hand controls and allowed the driver to keep both hands on the wheel while switching beams. In an era of narrow 2-lane roads and constant oncoming traffic, being able to dip your headlights instantly without reaching was considered an advantage. There was also a tactile certainty to it. The switch had a firm click you could feel through your shoe. Drivers didn't need to look for it. Muscle memory did all the work. Night driving developed its own choreography. Right foot managing speed, left foot hovering, ready to tap the dimmer in response to approaching headlights. It became automatic, almost subconscious, especially for drivers who learned on cars where this was the only way. But the system had obvious flaws, and time exposed them mercilessly. In emergency situations, especially hard braking, drivers would sometimes stab at the floor and hit the dimmer accidentally, plunging the road ahead into darkness or blinding oncoming traffic with high beams at exactly the wrong moment.
In unfamiliar cars, the switch could be slightly left or right, forcing drivers to hunt for it while driving, something that feels absurd by modern standards. Weather made things worse. Mud, snow, salt, and water all found their way into the footwell. Floor dimmers were notorious for corrosion and sticking. In winter climates, they could freeze. In older cars with leaky seals, moisture would cause intermittent failures that only showed up at night, the worst possible time. Many drivers remember stomping repeatedly at the floor, hoping the lights would change, while wondering if they were about to be pulled over or crash into something they couldn't see. As cars evolved, the original reasons for floor dimmers disappeared. Steering columns grew thicker and more complex, incorporating turn signals, wipers, washers, cruise control, and eventually lighting controls. Standardization became critical as traffic increased and driver training expanded. Manufacturers wanted every driver to instinctively know where basic controls were, regardless of brand. Putting the dimmer on a stock made far more sense for consistency and safety.
Bench seats as standard equipment weren't just a seating choice, they were a philosophy of how cars were meant to be used. For decades, especially from the 1930s through the late 1960s, the default American car interior was built around the idea that the front of the cabin was a shared space. One long, flat cushion stretched from door to door, usually upholstered in cloth or vinyl, sometimes with a thin line of stitching or a fold in the middle pretending to define individual places. But in reality, it was one continuous seat, and that was exactly the point. The bench seat existed because cars were social machines. Front bench seating allowed 3 people up front, which meant 6-passenger capacity without needing a larger vehicle. Families used it constantly, a parent driving, another adult beside them, and a child perched between, sometimes standing, sometimes half-sitting, sometimes leaning forward to see the road. From a modern safety perspective, it sounds horrifying, but at the time it felt normal, even cozy. Cars were extensions of the living room, not rolling safety cells. There was also a cultural element that's hard to separate from the hardware. Bench seats made closeness unavoidable. Couples slid together naturally. Date nights in the 1950s and early 1960s practically required a bench seat. Drive-in movies, late-night cruising, long road trips with an arm draped along the top of the seat back, all of that was enabled by the absence of a center console and the presence of one wide cushion. The car interior was open, fluid, informal. From a driving standpoint, bench seats were objectively awful. There was no lateral support at all. In corners, you didn't so much sit as migrate. Hard braking sent everyone sliding forward. Aggressive driving meant bracing yourself against the steering wheel or door. Performance cars with bench seats existed, but they were lying to themselves. Muscle cars could be ordered with them, but anyone who drove hard quickly learned that you were basically wrestling gravity every time the road curved. Safety, of course, was almost non-existent by modern standards. Early bench seats were often mounted with minimal reinforcement. Seat belts were optional for years, and when they arrived, they were awkwardly integrated, especially for the center passenger. Airbags were impossible to package properly with a shared front seat. As crash data accumulated and regulations tightened, the bench seat became a liability. It was difficult to restrain occupants, difficult to control seating position, and incompatible with the emerging idea that each person in a car needed a defined, protected space. The shift away from bench seats wasn't sudden, but it was inevitable. Bucket seats began appearing first in sporty models, marketed as individual and European-inspired. They promised control, support, and a more serious driving experience. Once center consoles followed, the transformation was complete. The front of the car was no longer a sofa. It became a cockpit. You sat in your place, not anywhere you wanted.
By the late 1970s and early 1980s, bench seats had become rare outside of trucks and full-size sedans, and even there they were slowly pushed aside. Younger buyers associated them with old cars, taxis, and grandparents. Automakers followed the market. What disappeared wasn't just a seat, but an entire way of thinking about driving. Cars stopped being communal spaces and started becoming individualized machines. Today, bench seats feel like artifacts from another world. They're remembered with a strange mix of fondness and disbelief. Fondness for the freedom, the closeness, the casual nature of travel. Disbelief at how exposed and uncontrolled everything was. The bench seat didn't die because it was unfashionable. It died because the world around cars changed. But when it vanished, it took with it a softer, more human kind of driving culture that modern interiors will never quite recreate.
Vent windows were one of those beautifully simple solutions that existed because engineers actually understood how people used cars before technology took over. Long before air conditioning became affordable or reliable, controlling airflow inside a car was a daily concern. Summers were hot, cabins were sealed poorly, and rolling down a full window at speed meant deafening wind noise, buffeting, and papers flying everywhere. The vent window solved all of that with almost embarrassing elegance. Mounted at the very front of the door near the A-pillar, these small triangular panes could pivot outward on a hinge. Their placement was not accidental. At speed, air pressure naturally builds up along the base of the windshield and the front edge of the side windows. By cracking the vent window open, that high-pressure air was captured and funneled directly into the cabin. You didn't just get air, you got a focused stream of it. Drivers could aim it precisely at their face, chest, or hands, which mattered on long drives when fatigue set in. Smokers loved them because they could pull smoke out of the cabin without opening a main window. Rainy weather drivers loved them because they reduced fogging without soaking the interior. What made vent windows special was how controllable they were. A tiny movement of the latch changed the airflow dramatically. Fully open, they created a strong jet of air. Slightly cracked, they gently circulated fresh air through the cabin. Combined with a partially opened rear window, they could create a smooth flow-through ventilation system that modern cars would later need fans and ducting to replicate. All of this happened without electricity, motors, sensors, or software. Just glass, a hinge, and basic physics. They were also incredibly durable. Vent windows rarely broke. The mechanisms were simple, and even when worn, they usually still worked. There was no motor to fail, no control module to glitch. In cold weather, they could be kept shut and sealed reasonably well. In hot climates, they were indispensable. Taxi drivers, long-haul drivers, and anyone without factory air conditioning relied on them daily. For decades, they were not a luxury feature, they were a necessity. Their disappearance wasn't because they were bad, but because the priorities of car design changed. As air conditioning became standard rather than optional, manufacturers no longer needed passive ventilation solutions. Aerodynamics also became critical. Vent windows disrupted airflow, increased drag, and created wind noise at higher speeds. Flush glass designs tested better in wind tunnels and reduced manufacturing complexity. Safety regulations also played a role, as frameless or one-piece side glass simplified side impact protection and sealing. There was also a cultural shift. Cars stopped being machines you interacted with physically and became environments you set and forgot. Climate control knobs replaced airflow intuition. Instead of adjusting glass and windows, drivers selected temperatures and fan speeds. The idea of manually directing outside air with a piece of glass started to feel old-fashioned, even if it worked better in some situations. Today, vent windows feel almost invisible to younger drivers. Many people under 30 have never used one and wouldn't immediately understand its purpose. To those who grew up with them, their absence is still felt. There's something deeply satisfying about catching a perfectly angled breeze at 50 miles per hour without noise, without electronics, without effort. Vent windows weren't flashy and they weren't marketed heavily, but they were one of the smartest comfort features ever put into a car.
They vanished not because they failed, but because the industry moved on from simplicity. Mechanical speedometers were more than just instruments. They were intimate, tactile interfaces between the driver and the machine. Unlike today's smooth electronic displays, these speedometers relied on a steel cable spinning inside a sheath connected directly to a gear on the transmission. The rotation translated into the movement of a needle or a set of rotating numbered drums, giving both a visual and a mechanical sense of velocity. There was a distinct hum as the cable spun faster, a slight vibration along the dash, and even tiny wobbles in the needle that mirrored the imperfections of the road beneath. Driving at speed became an almost physical experience. You didn't just see how fast you were going, you felt it in the car, through the dashboard, the steering column, and sometimes even in the floor. These instruments were imperfect in ways modern drivers would never tolerate. Cables could dry out, fray, or bind, causing sudden jumps or stalls in the reading. At high speeds, needles sometimes twitched or flicked back and forth, creating a kind of nervous energy in the cabin that reinforced the car's rawness. Numbers on drum-type speedometers could lag or stutter, producing a subtle rhythmic click-click as they rolled over each digit. Some drivers found it charming, others found it maddening. There was always the knowledge that your readout was alive, connected directly to the spinning gears of the transmission, subject to the quirks of the mechanical system. Beyond functionality, mechanical speedometers conveyed a psychological sense of speed. Drivers unconsciously gauged acceleration, not just by sight, but by vibration and sound. There was a rhythm to climbing from 20 to 60 miles per hour that you could feel in your hands and chest. Modern digital or electronic systems eliminated all of this nuance. Now the speed appears instantly and perfectly, but it is sterile, informational only, disconnected from the visceral relationship between man and machine. The mechanical system rewarded attention, subtly teaching drivers how their cars behaved under acceleration, cornering, or shifting loads. Their disappearance was inevitable. Electronic sensors offered unmatched accuracy, reliability, and flexibility. With digital displays, automakers could integrate trip computers, fuel efficiency readouts, and even heads-up projections. Maintenance became simpler, production cheaper, and reading easier for distracted drivers. Mechanical speedometers, once a source of charm and feedback, were suddenly obsolete. Yet what was lost with them was more than novelty. The vibrating cable, the rolling numbers, the subtle whine of a needle responding to torque, these were pieces of the driving experience that can never be replicated on a screen. Cars became faster, safer, and more precise, but quieter and emotionally flatter, stripped of a layer of sensory connection that mechanical speedometers provided naturally.
Cars of the mid-20th century were designed around a culture where smoking was not only common, but assumed. Every cabin was outfitted with ashtrays in multiple locations, the doors, the center armrests, even the backs of seats for rear passengers. The cigarette lighter itself was more than a novelty. It was standard equipment, a built-in tool for everyday life, and often the only way to ignite a cigarette while on the move. Automakers designed interiors around these features, shaping consoles, dashboards, and door panels to accommodate smokers comfortably. Carpets were treated to withstand ash, metal trim was polished to resist burn marks, and no interior detail was considered complete without a place to stub out a cigarette. The vehicle itself became a mobile lounge, a space where smoking was seamlessly integrated into the driving experience. These features weren't merely functional, they were social. Passengers could light up without inconvenience, drivers could smoke while gripping the wheel, and the ritual of the lighter and ashtray was part of the rhythm of travel. Designers even considered ergonomics, placing ashtrays within easy reach but out of the line of sight for a clean appearance. The flick of the lighter, the warm glow of the coil, and the gentle clink of the ashtray lid closing became subtle sensory cues, comforting in their familiarity. Interiors smelled faintly of leather and smoke, a defining character of American cars from the 1940s through the 1970s. The decline came slowly but inevitably. As public health campaigns gained traction and anti-smoking legislation increased, automakers began reducing the number of ashtrays, making them optional, and eventually removing them entirely. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, cars were increasingly sold without any smoking accommodations. Interestingly, the cigarette lighter socket survived, but its purpose shifted. Rebranded as a 12-volt power outlet, it became the backbone of charging phones, powering GPS units, and running small electronics. What had once been a flame-producing device was transformed into a source of modern convenience, a silent witness to the era when cars were designed with the assumption that everyone would smoke. The interiors lost a tactile ritual, a sensory layer, and a cultural artifact, replaced by plastic covers and USB ports, leaving a subtle void for anyone who remembers the smell of freshly lit tobacco mingling with warm vinyl and polished chrome. Manual choke knobs were a signature feature of older carbureted engines, a simple lever or pull knob that required drivers to actively participate in starting their cars, especially on cold mornings. Unlike modern vehicles, where fuel injection and electronic engine management handle air-fuel mixtures automatically, carburetors relied on a precise ratio of fuel and air. In cold conditions, fuel didn't vaporize properly, leading to rough running, stalling, or failure to start. The choke allowed drivers to enrich the mixture by restricting airflow, giving the engine what it needed to ignite efficiently. But it wasn't plug and play. Timing and subtlety were everything. Pull it too far, and the engine flooded. Push it in too early, and it would sputter and hesitate. Using the choke was a tactile, almost meditative experience. Drivers had to feel the engine settle, listen to the rhythm of the idle, watch the tachometer if available, and slowly ease the knob back as temperatures rose. It demanded patience and attentiveness, teaching a kind of mechanical empathy modern drivers rarely experience. Forgetting to adjust it or adjusting it too quickly could foul spark plugs, coat the intake with unburned fuel, and reduce engine life. Mechanics often joked that proper choke use separated experienced drivers from novices. It was an intimate handshake between man and machine each morning. The disappearance of manual chokes marked a dramatic shift in automotive interaction. Automatic chokes appeared in the 1950s and 1960s, using bimetallic springs and thermostatic devices to regulate the fuel mixture, gradually removing the need for driver intervention. Later, electronic fuel injection made the manual choke entirely obsolete. What was lost was more than inconvenience. It was a ritual, a morning rhythm that connected the driver to the mechanical heartbeat of the vehicle. Modern drivers can turn a key and leave instantly, unaware that earlier cars demanded attention, timing, and patience, and that every successful cold start was a small victory of skill, knowledge, and attentiveness. Fender-mounted turn signal indicators were a clever, tactile solution to a problem that seems trivial today, but was very real in the early and mid-20th century. On vehicles with long hoods, large bodies, or seating positions that made it hard to see the front corners, drivers often couldn't tell if their turn signals were actually illuminated. To solve this, automakers mounted small, often illuminated indicators directly on top of the front fenders. These lights, sometimes clear, amber, or red, allowed the driver to glance down and confirm that the signal was functioning, providing immediate feedback that was critical in busy streets or at night. Luxury cars, European imports, and high-end American models embraced the feature because it combined utility with sophistication, giving owners both reassurance and a sense of technological refinement. These fender indicators were mechanically and electrically complex. They required additional wiring, bulbs, and often dedicated circuits, which increased production cost and maintenance. They could fail independently, and repairs were more involved than simply replacing a dashboard bulb.
Yet for attentive drivers, they offered peace of mind. You could see the light flicker in the corner of your eye, the tiny glow confirming your intention before another driver could react. As dashboard indicator technology improved and bulbs became brighter and more reliable, fender-mounted indicators became redundant. Drivers could see the signals easily inside the car, making the extra exterior lights unnecessary. By the 1970s and 1980s, most manufacturers phased them out, and they survived only as design nods to the past. On modern cars, fender-mounted turn signals exist mostly as chrome or clear plastic styling references, a nostalgic wink to a time when automakers carefully considered the connection between the driver, the car, and the road, and when even a small light on a fender could make the difference between clarity and confusion.
Rear-facing third-row seats were once a hallmark of classic American station wagons, a feature that seemed like the ultimate combination of practicality, fun, and suburban ingenuity. Typically installed in the cargo area behind the main rear bench, these seats were often simple fold-down benches or individual jump seats mounted directly to the wagon's floor. Children adored them, seeing them as a private theater or lookout perch, where they could wave at passing motorists or gaze out over the rear bumper. Parents tolerated them because they expanded seating capacity without resorting to a second vehicle, making the station wagon a true family hauler. The design was inherently risky by modern standards. Most rear-facing seats lacked proper seat belts, headrests, or side impact protection. Inertia during sudden stops or collisions could throw passengers forward with little to prevent injury. Automakers relied on the padded interior surfaces and the relatively low speeds of suburban driving to mitigate danger. But the seats were always a compromise between space, novelty, and rudimentary safety. Despite these concerns, families embraced them for decades. Road trips, trips to school, or visits to grandparents were transformed by the unique experience of sitting backwards, a perspective that made even mundane journeys feel playful and adventurous. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, safety regulators began scrutinizing these designs more closely. Crash testing, evolving standards, and a growing understanding of passenger dynamics rendered the rear-facing cargo seat obsolete. Automakers gradually eliminated them, often replacing them with forward-facing jump seats integrated into the main cabin, or later, additional rows in SUVs with proper restraints. Modern three-row SUVs sometimes echo the concept, but today's versions are heavily engineered with seatbelts, headrests, and crash-resistant structures, stripping away the carefree recklessness that defined the original installations. What vanished along with the seats was not just a piece of hardware, but an era's philosophy, the idea that family cars could be whimsical, flexible, and slightly dangerous, a reflection of a time when driving was an adventure and cars were designed for fun as much as function.
Hand-crank windows were once a universal feature on nearly every automobile, a simple, honest mechanism that connected driver and passenger directly to the car's hardware. A twist of the wrist, a push, a gentle pull, these motions controlled ventilation, allowing the flow of air into the cabin exactly as desired. Each window was its own small machine, with gears, regulators, and arms translating human effort into movement. In an era before air conditioning was standard, these cranks were not just conveniences, they were essential. Opening a window on a hot day required a little muscle, a moment of engagement, a tactile interaction that reminded drivers they were operating a living machine, not just sitting passively inside one. The system was not without its quirks. Windows could stick if regulators wore, cranks could feel jerky or misaligned, and operating them while driving sometimes required a delicate balancing act. But these were challenges that offered intimacy with the car. Each successful roll-up or roll-down provided satisfaction and a sense of control over the environment, a small ritual repeated countless times on morning commutes, family trips, and long road journeys. Passengers could adjust their own window without pressing buttons or worrying about fuses, and repairs, when needed, were mechanical and understandable. No electronics, no mystery failures. With the rise of power windows in the 1960s and 1970s, the humble crank began its decline. Press a button, and the window moved effortlessly, silently, and uniformly. Comfort and convenience won out over tactile engagement and mechanical honesty. By the 1990s, hand crank windows were relegated almost entirely to base trims or economy cars, associated not with craftsmanship, but with cheapness. In mainstream vehicles, they disappeared entirely. What vanished with them was more than a tool. It was a philosophy of interaction, a moment of connection between human and machine that encouraged patience, awareness, and a subtle sense of accomplishment. Modern drivers rarely realize what was lost, a small mechanical ritual that made cars feel alive, responsive, and undeniably human.
Pop-up radio antennas were one of those small, magical details that made cars of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s feel like futuristic machines rather than mere transportation. Unlike modern integrated antennas hidden behind windshields or shark fin modules, these devices were fully mechanical, requiring motors, gears, and precision linkages to rise and retract smoothly. When the radio was switched on, a tiny whirring sound would emanate from the fender or rear quarter panel, and the metal mast would slowly climb into the air, seemingly alive and responding to the driver's action. It was a moment of theater, the car performing a mechanical ritual to bring sound into the cabin. Shutting off the radio caused the mast to descend quietly, disappearing almost magically into the bodywork, leaving nothing but a clean surface and the memory of movement. These antennas were more than decorative, they served a real purpose. Long metal masts provided far better reception than fixed or hidden alternatives of the era, picking up AM and FM signals clearly, even in remote areas. Yet the magic was in the combination of function and spectacle. Drivers and passengers alike learned to associate that slow, precise rise with anticipation, the promise of music filling the car, of road trips made more lively by the comforting presence of radio DJs, rock bands, or news broadcasts. The soft electric whir, the smooth motion, the tiny vibration transmitted through the body of the car, all these details became part of the sensory experience of driving, a subtle mechanical intimacy that modern cars rarely replicate. At the same time, pop-up antennas were notoriously fragile. Ice or snow could freeze the mechanism solid, bending or jamming the mast. Car washes could catch and break the delicate mast or motor. Even vandals could twist or snap it. The mechanical complexity meant that failures were frequent, and repairs involved fiddly components, gears, and electrical motors, tasks beyond the comfort of many owners. Despite their charm, the costs and inconveniences were real, and over time, manufacturers sought alternatives that preserved reception without the liability. Glass-mounted antennas, hidden within windshields, or later shark fin designs, eliminated moving parts, weather vulnerability, and vandalism risk, while providing adequate performance and a sleeker, more modern aesthetic. Yet, in removing pop-up antennas, the industry also removed a layer of mechanical poetry. There was a performative element in each drive, a small, deliberate motion that made the car feel alive and responsive, a tactile reminder that machinery could have personality. The whirring of the antenna was a soundtrack of expectation, a reassuring sound that technology was at work on your behalf. Today, the disappearance of pop-up antennas is more than a shift in engineering. It marks the end of a moment when cars engaged the senses, connected to the driver through sound, motion, and anticipation. They are remembered now purely as nostalgia, as symbols of a time when even the act of turning on a radio was a miniature mechanical event, full of charm, imperfection, and delight.